They said the most feared man in the city could buy anything with a single phone call, but on the night of his birthday, he couldn't buy a single person willing to stand beside him. The Romano Estate shimmered beneath the cold glow of thousands of lights, every marble column polished until it reflected the crystal chandeliers hanging above the grand ballroom, every silver tray arranged with military precision, every chair positioned around tables dressed in white linen as if the evening were about to welcome governors, celebrities, and old allies whose names once carried weight across every corner of the city. Fresh white orchids filled the air with a faint fragrance, a string quartet quietly rehearsed in the corner, and a towering birthday cake stood beneath a glass dome, waiting for a celebration that seemed destined to become unforgettable. At precisely 7 o'clock, the front gates remained closed. The long driveway stretching nearly a quarter-mile from the entrance to the mansion lay completely empty except for the gentle glow of lanterns lining each side. No engines echoed through the hills. No luxury sedans rolled toward the entrance. No footsteps climbed the marble staircase. Inside the ballroom, dozens of staff members exchanged uncertain glances while pretending to stay busy. Every few minutes, someone discreetly checked a phone, hoping another guest had simply been delayed by traffic. The minutes slipped away in complete silence. In a private room overlooking the ballroom, Ethan Romano sat motionless in a sleek wheelchair positioned beside a floor-to-ceiling window. At 42, his sharp features still carried the quiet authority that had once made powerful executives lower their voices the moment he entered a room. His tailored charcoal suit fit perfectly across his shoulders, his dark hair neatly combed, and a simple silver watch rested on his wrist. Nothing about his appearance revealed defeat, yet the untouched birthday invitation lying on the small table beside him somehow felt heavier than everything else in the room. His eyes remained fixed on the empty driveway below, never blinking whenever distant headlights briefly appeared before turning toward neighboring estates instead. Exactly 1 year earlier, invitations to Ethan Romano's birthday had been considered impossible to decline. Tonight, every acceptance had slowly transformed into polite excuses. Family emergencies. Business flights. Unexpected illnesses. Last-minute meetings. Respect had quietly dissolved into convenient absence. No one wanted to witness what remained of a man whose life had changed after a devastating accident left him unable to walk. Wealth still surrounded him. Influence still carried his name. But loneliness had entered through the front door without asking permission. Behind the partially open doorway stood Naomi Carter, the newest maid in the mansion. 27 years old, soft-spoken, and almost invisible to everyone around her, she clutched a neatly folded linen napkin against her chest as though it gave her courage. She had spent only 3 months working inside the Romano Estate, never speaking unless spoken to, never lifting her eyes for longer than a second. Yet something inside her refused to leave. While the musicians quietly packed away their instruments and the catering staff began whispering about clearing the untouched dinner, Naomi remained exactly where she was, watching the lonely man stare into the darkness outside. She didn't know his secrets. She didn't know the stories people whispered about him. She only knew that no birthday should end with one candle burning for someone who had no one left to celebrate beside him. The silence inside the Romano Estate grew heavier with every passing minute until even the ticking of the antique grandfather clock seemed too loud for the room. Members of the household staff quietly began removing untouched glasses from the tables, careful not to let crystal touch crystal loudly enough to disturb the man watching the empty driveway. No one gave instructions because none were necessary. They all understood that the celebration had ended before it had ever begun. Ethan remained beside the window without asking anyone to stay or leave. Years earlier, he had built a reputation for reading people with remarkable accuracy. He could recognize hesitation before a word was spoken and loyalty before a promise was made. Those instincts had helped him lead an empire that stretched far beyond luxury hotels, restaurants, and international investments. Business leaders once waited weeks for an appointment with him. Charity organizations proudly displayed his name on plaques. Local newspapers followed every public appearance, eager to photograph the confident businessman whose calm voice always seemed to control every room. Yet none of those accomplishments could persuade a single guest to walk through his front door tonight. Ever since the accident changed his life 2 years earlier, the invitations had become fewer, the phone calls shorter, and the promises less sincere. People who once insisted they were family slowly disappeared behind busy schedules and convenient explanations. Even distant relatives who had once celebrated every holiday inside the estate now preferred sending expensive gift baskets rather than spending an hour in his company. Ethan had never complained. He simply noticed. Quietly. Patiently. Like a man watching autumn leaves disappear one by one until only bare branches remained. His wheelchair had become more than a piece of medical equipment. Too many people, it had become a symbol they could not bear to face. They remembered the powerful man he used to be and did not know how to speak to the one sitting before them now. Their discomfort became distance, and distance slowly became silence. Ethan understood that better than anyone, which was why he no longer expected miracles from birthdays, holidays, or family gatherings. Expectations, he had learned, often hurt more than disappointment itself. Downstairs, the ballroom gradually returned to its ordinary elegance. The candles continued burning even though there was no audience left to admire them. The enormous cake remained untouched beneath its glass cover, its smooth white frosting reflecting the chandelier above like fresh snow beneath moonlight. Naomi quietly carried folded table linens toward the service hallway, but every few steps she found herself looking back toward the staircase leading to Ethan's private suite. She had noticed something the other employees seemed determined not to mention. Not once during the evening had anyone wished him a happy birthday. They had discussed schedules, deliveries, decorations, and cleanup, but no one had spoken the simple words that children offered freely and strangers exchanged without hesitation. It was as though everyone feared acknowledging the occasion would somehow make the loneliness more real. Naomi lowered her eyes again, remembering her own father, who had spent his final years sitting alone on the front porch of their small house every birthday after illness stole the strength from his legs. Neighbors who had once visited every weekend slowly stopped coming. Friends who promised to return never did. She still remembered watching him smile politely whenever another day passed without a knock at the door, pretending he had expected nothing while secretly hoping for everything. Standing in the quiet hallway of the Romano estate, surrounded by unimaginable wealth that somehow felt painfully empty, Naomi felt the same ache returning to her heart, and for the first time since arriving at the mansion, she realized that the loneliest people were not always the ones with the least. Sometimes they were simply the ones everyone assumed would never need anyone at all. Most of the staff had already changed out of their formal uniforms by the time the mansion settled into its familiar nighttime routine. The ballroom lights were dimmed one by one until only the soft glow from the chandeliers remained, casting long reflections across the polished marble floor. Housekeepers quietly folded tablecloths, servers wheeled untouched meals back toward the kitchens, and florists carefully removed arrangements that had never been admired by a single guest. Naomi worked alongside them without speaking, just as she always did. Her quiet nature often caused people to forget she was even in the room. Some employees barely remembered her name, referring to her simply as the new maid whenever schedules were discussed. She never corrected them. Remaining unnoticed had become a habit long before she ever stepped inside the Romano estate. Growing up in a modest neighborhood outside Baltimore had taught her that gentle people were often overlooked, but she had also learned that kindness did not require recognition. While others hurried to finish their duties and return home, Naomi found herself slowing down each time she passed the grand staircase leading toward Ethan's private wing. She could not explain why her thoughts kept returning to the man sitting alone behind those enormous windows. She had exchanged fewer than 20 words with him during the 3 months she had worked there. Every morning she quietly dusted the library before sunrise, arranged fresh flowers outside his study, and carefully polished the framed photographs lining the hallway. She noticed details few others seemed to see. His coffee always cooled untouched whenever it was served before important meetings. The books on his desk were carefully opened but rarely read beyond the same few pages. Every evening he paused beside the portrait of his late parents before returning to his room, his expression softening for only a heartbeat before the familiar mask of composure returned. The other employees respected him, but from a distance. They followed instructions, completed assignments, and avoided unnecessary conversation. Some believed silence showed professionalism. Others simply feared saying the wrong thing. Naomi saw something different. She saw a man surrounded by people yet somehow existing outside every conversation taking place around him. Earlier that afternoon, while preparing guest rooms that had never been occupied, she had quietly overheard two senior staff members discussing the evening. One sighed with disappointment and remarked that the invitations had probably been a mistake from the beginning. The other simply shrugged and answered that powerful people eventually became lonely because everyone wanted something from them. Naomi had continued folding fresh towels without interrupting, but those words remained with her long after the conversation ended. She wondered if loneliness truly belonged only to the powerful, or whether it simply looked different depending on where a person stood in life. As she carried the final stack of polished silver trays through the service corridor, she noticed the birthday cake still waiting exactly where it had been placed hours earlier. The candles had never been lit, the delicate icing remained flawless. A small silver plaque resting beside it read, "Happy birthday, Mr. Romano," in elegant script that no one had taken the time to read aloud. Naomi stopped walking. For several quiet seconds, she stared at the untouched cake while memories she had buried years ago slowly returned. She remembered baking a small chocolate cake with her mother for her father's last birthday, decorating it with uneven frosting because they could not afford professional decorations. Only 3 people had been there that evening, yet her father had smiled as though the room were filled with hundreds. He had once told her that a celebration was never measured by the number of guests but by whether someone cared enough to stay. Standing alone beside Ethan's untouched birthday cake, Naomi felt those words settle gently into her heart. Without realizing it, she made a silent decision that would carry her back into the empty ballroom before the night was over. The last kitchen timer chimed just after 10:30, signaling the end of another long shift. One by one, the remaining employees signed out, gathered their coats, and disappeared through the staff entrance with the quiet goodnights that echoed briefly before fading into the cool night air. Within minutes, the enormous estate felt strangely still, as though the mansion itself had grown tired of pretending it had hosted a celebration. Naomi remained behind, organizing the final serving trays while the head butler approached the ballroom with a clipboard tucked beneath his arm. He glanced around the empty room, let out a weary sigh, and spoke softly to the 2 remaining housekeepers. "Dispose of the cake in the morning. Remove the decorations before sunrise. Mr. Romano will not want to see any reminders." No one questioned the instruction. They simply nodded and disappeared into separate hallways until only Naomi remained standing beside the untouched table. She looked toward the grand staircase, then back at the birthday cake resting beneath its glass cover. The candles still waited in perfect rows, untouched and silent, as though they had been hoping someone would arrive at the very last moment. Naomi slowly reached forward and lifted the glass dome with careful hands. The faint scent of vanilla and buttercream filled the quiet ballroom. She stared at the cake for several seconds before gently placing the cover on the table beside it. Then she glanced toward the security cameras mounted high in the corners of the ceiling. She knew every hallway in the mansion was monitored, yet something inside her quietly insisted that doing the right thing sometimes mattered more than being noticed. Instead of leaving, she walked into the kitchen. The chefs had already cleaned every surface until the stainless steel counters reflected the ceiling lights like mirrors. Naomi carefully opened one cabinet after another until she found a small box of birthday candles reserved for emergency replacements. She gathered a handful, along with a simple silver lighter resting beside the stove. On another shelf she discovered unopened hot chocolate mix, fresh strawberries, and a small container of whipped cream. None of it had been ordered for the banquet. It had simply been forgotten. She smiled faintly, carrying everything back toward the ballroom with a quiet determination. The enormous room suddenly felt too large for a single person, so she gently pushed several oversized chairs aside and rolled one smaller round table closer to the fireplace. She transferred the cake there, arranged the strawberries around the base, poured steaming hot chocolate into a white porcelain cup, and folded a clean linen napkin beside the plate. There was nothing extravagant about the arrangement. In fact, compared to the lavish decorations surrounding it, the little table appeared almost insignificant. Yet somehow it felt warmer than the grand banquet ever had. Naomi looked toward the staircase once more, took a slow breath, and began making her way to Ethan's private floor. Every step across the polished hallway made her heart beat faster. She had never approached his room without being summoned. She imagined countless reasons why she should turn around. She might lose her job. She might embarrass him. He might refuse to see her altogether. But then she remembered her father's quiet smile on that final birthday years ago and the words he had spoken while blowing out 3 crooked candles. Sometimes all a person needs is proof that someone remembered. Naomi stopped outside Ethan's door and gently raised her hand. For a brief moment, her fingers trembled in the silence. Then, with all the courage she had been quietly gathering throughout the evening, she softly knocked. The soft knock barely disturbed the silence beyond the heavy wooden door. For several long seconds, Naomi wondered if Ethan had fallen asleep beside the window or simply chosen not to answer. She was about to turn away when his calm voice finally reached her. "Come in." She slowly opened the door and stepped inside, keeping her eyes lowered out of habit. The room was illuminated only by a reading lamp and the pale moonlight spilling through the enormous windows overlooking the city. Ethan had not moved far from where she had last seen him. His wheelchair remained beside the glass, his hands resting quietly on the blanket covering his legs. He looked toward her with a polite curiosity rather than annoyance. "Is something wrong?" he asked gently. Naomi tightened her grip around the lighter hidden inside her apron pocket before quietly answering. "No, sir. I was wondering if you would come downstairs with me for just a few minutes." Ethan studied her face with a quiet patience. Few people ever asked him to go anywhere after evening meetings ended. Most assumed he preferred solitude. "At this hour?" he asked. Naomi nodded. "Yes, sir. If you do not mind." A faint smile almost appeared before disappearing again. "You seem very determined for someone who hardly speaks." Naomi felt her cheeks grow warm, but she simply replied, "Please trust me." For reasons he could not fully explain, Ethan did he pressed the control on his wheelchair, and together they slowly made their way through the silent hallways. The mansion that had seemed so grand only hours earlier now felt peaceful, almost intimate, as though every empty corridor had been waiting for this quiet journey. When they entered the ballroom, Ethan immediately noticed that everything had changed. The towering banquet tables were gone from the center of the room. Instead, a single round table waited beside the fireplace. The birthday cake rested there surrounded by fresh strawberries, a steaming mug of hot chocolate, and a single linen napkin folded with careful hands. Naomi walked ahead, placed the remaining candles onto the cake one by one, and carefully lit each small flame. Their warm glow reflected across the polished floor, replacing the cold brilliance of the chandeliers with something far gentler. Ethan remained completely still. His eyes moved slowly across the tiny table, the homemade arrangement, and finally toward the young woman who stood nervously beside it. "You did this?" he asked almost in a whisper. Naomi nodded without meeting his eyes. "I did not think anyone should end a birthday without hearing the song at least once." Before Ethan could respond, Naomi quietly began singing Happy Birthday. Her voice was soft, almost trembling, but every word filled the enormous ballroom with unexpected warmth. There was no orchestra, no applause, and no crowd of important guests. Only one shy maid singing to one lonely man beneath the glow of a few flickering candles. When the song ended, the silence that followed felt entirely different from the silence that had filled the mansion earlier that evening. It no longer carried disappointment. It carried kindness. Ethan stared at the tiny flames for several moments before looking back at Naomi. His expression softened in a way she had never seen before. The walls of composure he had spent years building seemed to grow just a little lighter beneath the candlelight. Finally, with a quiet smile that reached his eyes for the first time that night, he spoke only one question. "Why would you do all of this, for me?" Naomi lowered her eyes, suddenly aware of how quiet the ballroom had become. The tiny candle flames danced gently between them, their warm light softening the sharp edges of the room until the vast mansion no longer felt cold. She folded her hands together, searching for the courage to answer honestly. "Because someone once did not come," she said so quietly that Ethan almost thought he had imagined the words. He waited without interrupting. For the first time in years, he found himself wanting to hear another person's story more than his own. Naomi slowly lifted her gaze just enough to meet his for a brief moment. "My father became paralyzed after a serious illness when I was 16. Before that, our house was always full. Neighbors visited every weekend. Friends stopped by after work. My father laughed louder than anyone I knew." Her voice remained steady, but every memory seemed to add weight to each word. Then everything changed. People still called during the first few weeks. They promised they would visit soon. They said they were praying for us. But little by little, the visits stopped. The phone became quieter. Holidays became smaller. Birthdays became almost invisible. Ethan listened without speaking, his hands resting motionless on the armrests of his wheelchair. Naomi continued, her eyes fixed on the flickering candles instead of the man before her. "On his last birthday, my mother baked a chocolate cake from a boxed mix because that was all we could afford. We placed 3 candles on top because we could not find enough matching ones. My father wore his favorite sweater even though he never left the living room anymore. He kept looking toward the front window every few minutes." She paused, taking a slow breath before continuing. "No one knocked on the door. Not one friend. Not one relative. He smiled anyway. He thanked my mother and me for making the day special, but later that night, after he thought I was asleep, I heard him crying." Ethan lowered his head. The ballroom felt impossibly still. Naomi swallowed gently before finishing the story she had carried inside her heart for years. "A few months before he passed away, he told me something I have never forgotten. He said that people often celebrate success because it is easy, but the people who stay after life becomes difficult are the ones who truly love you. He asked me to remember that whenever I met someone who felt forgotten." Her voice softened even more. "When I saw your birthday ending tonight, I remembered him sitting beside our window, waiting for someone who never came. He could not change what happened to my father. But I could keep someone else from feeling that same loneliness." Ethan closed his eyes for a long moment. Throughout his career, he had listened to business negotiations worth millions of dollars, speeches filled with admiration, and countless promises of loyalty. Yet none of those conversations had ever reached him the way Naomi's simple words had. They carried no expectation, no request, and no hidden purpose. Only compassion. When he finally opened his eyes again, they rested on the young woman standing nervously beside the small birthday table. The loneliness that had followed him for 2 years suddenly felt just a little lighter. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached toward the cake. Naomi smiled through glistening eyes as he closed his own for a brief moment, made a quiet wish known only to himself, and gently blew out the candles, leaving a faint trail of smoke rising into the peaceful night. The candles had barely stopped smoking before something inside Ethan began to change. It was not dramatic, and it certainly was not visible to anyone beyond the ballroom that night. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, like the first light before sunrise. He looked at the small table one more time, then at the shy young woman who had expected nothing in return for her kindness. For the first time in 2 years, he realized that someone had seen him not as a symbol of power, not as a wealthy businessman, and not as a man confined to a wheelchair, but simply as another human being who deserved to be remembered. "Thank you, Naomi," he said, speaking her name carefully, as though committing it to memory. She smiled gently and lowered her eyes. "You are welcome, sir." There were no grand speeches after that. Together they shared a slice of birthday cake while the fireplace crackled softly nearby. Ethan even accepted the mug of hot chocolate she had prepared, wrapping his hands around the warm porcelain as if it carried something far greater than warmth. They spoke only a little, yet every quiet conversation somehow felt more meaningful than the countless formal meetings that had once filled his calendar. Naomi told him about her mother, who still volunteered every Saturday at a neighborhood food pantry despite having very little herself. Ethan listened with genuine interest. In return, he shared stories about his childhood in a modest Korean-American household where his parents insisted that respect was earned through humility rather than success. Hours passed without either of them noticing. When midnight finally arrived, Naomi quietly gathered the empty plates and prepared to return everything to the kitchen. As she turned to leave, Ethan spoke once more. "Will you have breakfast with me tomorrow morning?" Naomi looked surprised. "Sir." "Not as staff," he clarified with a gentle smile. "As someone I would like to thank properly." She hesitated, uncertain whether such a thing was appropriate. "If that would make you uncomfortable, I understand." Naomi slowly nodded. "I would be honored." The following morning, something unusual happened inside the Romano estate. The kitchen staff exchanged confused glances when they learned that breakfast had been prepared for two at the sunroom overlooking the gardens instead of being delivered to Ethan's private office. The head butler quietly observed as Naomi entered wearing her usual simple uniform, expecting she might only be serving the meal. Instead, Ethan invited her to sit across from him. Their conversation lasted nearly an hour. They spoke about books, favorite childhood meals, music, and ordinary memories that had nothing to do with business or wealth. Several employees happened to pass the sunroom during that time, and each one noticed the same remarkable detail. Ethan was smiling. Not the polite expression he wore during public appearances, but a genuine smile that softened his entire face. Over the weeks that followed, small changes quietly spread throughout the mansion. Ethan began joining his physical therapy sessions without canceling them halfway through. He started spending time in the gardens again instead of remaining inside his study. He asked employees about their families by name and thanked them personally at the end of each workday. The atmosphere throughout the estate slowly transformed. Laughter became more common in the kitchens. Conversations grew warmer in the hallways. Even the flowers placed outside Ethan's office somehow seemed brighter beneath the afternoon sunlight. No one could fully explain what had changed. Only Naomi understood that sometimes a person's heart did not begin healing because life became easier. Sometimes it began healing because, after a very long time, someone simply chose to stay. Nearly 6 months passed, and the Romano estate no longer felt like a mansion waiting for memories that never arrived. Fresh flowers appeared in every hallway because Ethan had quietly asked the gardening staff to choose whatever blooms made them happiest instead of following expensive design catalogs. The kitchen prepared family-style lunches once a week so employees from every department could share a meal together instead of eating alone during separate shifts. Even the security team, once known for speaking only when necessary, now exchanged friendly greetings with housekeepers every morning. It was a small change, almost impossible to measure, yet everyone felt it. The greatest surprise, however, arrived on a bright Monday morning when several luxury vehicles pulled through the front gates one after another. Visitors who had not appeared for birthdays, holidays, or ordinary afternoons suddenly requested private meetings with Ethan. Former business partners arrived carrying expensive gifts wrapped in gold paper. Distant relatives sent elaborate floral arrangements accompanied by handwritten cards filled with warm words that had been noticeably absent for years. Executives who once claimed to be too busy suddenly discovered openings in their calendars. The mansion buzzed with activity as assistants announced names that had not been spoken inside the estate for months. Naomi quietly watched from the library doorway while arranging fresh lilies in a crystal vase. She recognized many of the faces from framed photographs displayed throughout the mansion. They smiled politely, complimented Ethan's improving health, and spoke confidently about rebuilding old friendships. Yet she could not forget the empty ballroom on the night when every one of those chairs had remained vacant. Ethan welcomed each visitor with the same calm courtesy he had always possessed. He thanked them for coming, offered refreshments, and listened patiently as they spoke about future plans and renewed partnerships. There was no bitterness in his voice and no sign of anger in his expression. Instead, there was something far more powerful. Clarity. After the final meeting concluded, the guests gathered in the grand sitting room, expecting Ethan to announce new projects and celebrate the return of familiar faces. Instead, he looked around the room for several quiet moments before speaking. I appreciate every person who came today, he began. Life has taught me that circumstances change, schedules become complicated, and people often carry burdens we cannot see. The room remained silent. But I also learned something far more valuable on my last birthday. His eyes slowly moved toward the hallway where Naomi had just finished placing the flowers. She immediately lowered her head, believing he was simply looking past her. The greatest gift I received was not expensive, influential, or impressive. It came from someone who had every reason to walk away but chose to stay. Every guest turned to follow his gaze until they found the quiet young maid standing near the doorway with her hands folded neatly before her. Naomi looked completely startled. Ethan smiled gently. Many people respected my success. Very few respected my humanity. One person reminded me that dignity is not measured by applause or popularity. It is measured by compassion when no one else is watching. No one spoke. The silence filling the room was different from the silence that had surrounded his birthday months earlier. This one carried reflection instead of emptiness. Ethan asked the head butler to bring forward a small velvet box resting inside his study. When it was placed into Naomi's hands, she looked at him with confusion. Inside was a delicate silver key engraved with the words Family Garden. Ethan explained that a quiet section of the estate, overlooking the lake, had been renovated into a peaceful garden where every employee and their loved ones would always be welcome. Then he looked directly at Naomi and said, "You reminded me that a home is not built by walls. It is built by the people who refuse to leave when the room becomes quiet." 1 year later, the Romano estate looked alive in a way no amount of wealth had ever accomplished before. Warm laughter drifted through the gardens long before sunset. Children chased one another across the wide green lawn while their parents smiled from beneath white tents, and the fragrance of fresh flowers mixed with the scent of homemade food carried from the outdoor kitchen. There were no extravagant displays designed to impress strangers and no endless rows of luxury cars waiting to be admired. Instead, every corner of the estate reflected something far simpler and infinitely more valuable. It felt like home. Ethan sat beneath an old oak tree overlooking the lake, the same peaceful place that had become the family garden months earlier. His wheelchair rested beside a long wooden table built by local craftsmen, surrounded not by business executives or distant acquaintances, but by the people who filled the mansion with life every day. Gardeners, cooks, drivers, housekeepers, maintenance workers, security officers, and their families gathered together as equals, sharing stories, passing plates across the table, and laughing without hesitation. There were no assigned seats based on status. Everyone belonged. As the evening sky turned shades of gold and deep blue, the head butler quietly approached Ethan and asked whether it was time to begin the birthday celebration. Ethan smiled and nodded. This time, before anyone could bring out the cake, he gently raised his hand. "There is one person who should be here first," he said. Naomi, who had been helping several children decorate cookies near the garden fountain, looked up in surprise when she heard her name. She slowly walked toward the gathering, still carrying the same quiet humility that had never changed despite everything that had happened during the past year. Ethan motioned toward the empty chair beside him. "This seat has been waiting for you." Naomi hesitated. "Sir, I should stay with the staff." Ethan softly shook his head. "You are exactly where you belong." The entire garden fell silent as she accepted the invitation and sat beside him. Moments later, the birthday cake appeared, much smaller than the towering masterpiece from the year before, yet somehow far more beautiful. It had been baked by the kitchen staff using a family recipe Naomi had shared from her mother's worn recipe notebook. The frosting was simple, the decorations handmade, and the candles were slightly uneven, reminding Naomi of another birthday many years ago in a small living room filled with love instead of abundance. Before anyone began singing, Ethan looked around at every face gathered before him. Some had worked beside him for decades. Others had arrived only recently. Yet each person had chosen to spend the evening together without obligation or expectation. He smiled with a quiet gratitude before speaking. Last year I believed I had lost almost everything that mattered. Tonight I understand that I was simply waiting to discover what truly mattered all along. Titles fade. Wealth changes. Success comes and goes. But kindness remains. Loyalty remains. The people who stay when there is nothing to gain become the greatest blessing life can ever give us. His words settled gently over the gathering as every candle flickered in the evening breeze. Then everyone joined together to sing Happy Birthday, their voices filling the garden with warmth that reached far beyond the estate itself. Naomi smiled through quiet tears, not because she had changed Ethan's life alone, but because one small act of compassion had reminded an entire household that dignity begins with remembering another person's humanity. As the final candle was gently blown out beneath the stars, no one rushed to leave, no one searched for excuses, and no one looked toward the gates. They simply stayed together, proving that the richest person is never the one who owns the most, but the one whose table is filled with people who choose to remain. And on that peaceful evening, everyone present remembered what dignity truly looks like.